Chapter 20, Section 4 deals with how we quantify or determine if natural selection is playing a role in a species' success. So what we call that when we start to quantify natural selection is species reproductive fitness. So what does that mean? Well, when we're talking about fitness, we're not talking about um, physical fitness here. We're talking about reproductive fitness. How much or how well individuals of a certain type in a population leave offspring for the next generation when you're comparing specific phenotype differences. And it is, kind of relative. There are lots of things that play into it, but basically the most fit phenotype is the one that produces the greatest number of offspring. So when you talk about fitness, there's lots of aspects to it. There's survival, right? How long you survive as a member of a population will play into how fit you are, right? Clearly the things that survive the longest are more fit than things that do not. Sexual selection is a component of fitness because some individuals will attract mates better and are more successful at that than others. And then also, how many offspring do you produce per mating? Are there a lot of offspring but lots of them die? Are there very few offspring but you have to invest all your energy in raising them? Or, where is the trade-off at? And then when you look at these traits for fitness, maybe you have long survival, but that is not necessarily a benefit for another one of these other components. Or maybe, you have very bright plumage, so you're very successful at attracting mates. Well, but that very bright plumage leads to a shorter survival time for you because you're a clear mark for a predator. So overall then, when we're talking about natural selection and fitness, natural selection favors those phenotypes that have the greatest fitness, or those that can put the most offspring into the next generation. And then the phenotype that can do that, well, that is the phenotype that typically increases in frequency within that population because that is the phenotype that is selected for. An example of that would be the water striders. You've probably seen these bugs floating on the surface of ponds or lakes. Water striders come in a range of sizes and lengths. So as you look at them, the larger female water striders are going to lay more eggs per day. However, since they're bigger and easier to see and get for fish swimming beneath them, or for birds picking them out of the water, those large females don't really survive quite as long. The shorter, smaller ones, they just don't have as long of a life. They don't have as much longevity. They're just not as healthy. So what then actually occurs is it's not the ones that lay more eggs per day, but it's the ones that live longest, so that over the course of their life, they actually produce the most offspring. And that would be the intermediate sized individuals, the intermediate sized water striders. And so you can look at these three data tables up here, right? This one is looking at the number of eggs laid per day, and you can see as the length or as the size of the water strider increases, so does the number of eggs. This one is the lifespan of an adult female, and you can see how as you look at the length or the size of the water strider, their lifespan decreases. And this one, number of eggs laid during a lifetime, here's your smallest water striders with the fewest eggs. It peaks then at that intermediate size and then drops off with the larger sizes. So just a nice breakdown of the data. So then that might make you think, well then are we pushing a population just into one category of phenotype then and really decreasing variation? But isn't variation what we said evolution requires, right? Natural selection requires variation. So how does being fit for your environment not kind of fly in the face of variation? Well, it's because there are ways to maintain that variation. So the first type is what we call frequency-dependent selection. And so natural selection can play a role in the maintenance of variety, because frequency-dependent selection is talking about the fitness of a phenotype within this population, depending upon how many of them there are, depending upon its frequency within the population. So the fitness of the phenotype depends on how many of that particular type of organism is in the population. And so you can have negative frequency dependent selection and you can have positive. Now, negative frequency dependent selection says that the rare phenotypes are favored by selection, which means that like predators that might prey on a specific, let's say snail type, look for the typical, type, this search image. They know what they look like. This is what they're hunting. They find that kind of snail because they're familiar with what it looks like. Well, if you have a rare phenotype in that same population that doesn't look like the typical, well, then they might not be eaten by the predator. Therefore, they're going to survive, right? Natural selection favors, in negative frequency dependent selection, natural selection favors those rare phenotypes. Then you have positive frequency dependent selection. This favors that common form. So this is just the opposite, where the rare ones tend to stand out, and if you stand out, you're going to be eliminated very easily because the predator picks you out of the group first, right? So those are your two types. You got negative frequency dependent and positive frequency dependent selection. Right, and so this is another example of that in water boatmen, which is like those little diving bugs that sometimes you see in pools, or they're freshwater organisms. Water boatmen, the fish are going to eat that common color type more than they would by chance alone. So fish know what they're looking for. That search image has been formed in their brain, and they know what they're trying to pick off. The other ones that don't have that typical brown color or common color tend to survive longer. And then this image is just trying to show you the positive frequency dependent, where the more common type is favored. And if you are an individual who looks different than the rest, you're going to stand out and you're going to be easier prey for a predator. And then we have oscillating selection. So you got frequency dependent selection, which either favors the common or favors the rare phenotypes, and I have oscillating selection, and this is where it really just depends. Honestly, one phenotype can be favored at one time and a different phenotype can be favored at another time, and this really does help maintain genetic variation in a population. It really just depends on like what the environmental situation is. So in this case, you have individuals who really are pretty easygoing in terms of what they feed on in a population. So like the ground finches on the Galapagos Islands. Remember, Darwin studied all those finches and their beak types. Well, these ground finches, the birds with big bills, are favored. Natural selection favors these birds during a drought, because during a drought you have the seeds that get really hard shells on them, and so the birds with the bigger bills are favored. Now, these are all the same species still, right? However, if you're a bird born with a little bit smaller bill, then you have to forage for smaller seeds. And so you're going to really thrive when it's a rainy season, right? When there's very wet conditions and the seeds have very thin seeds. So natural selection favors different birds at different times in this particular case. We've talked about heterozygote advantage before. This is another way that natural selection maintains variation in a population. We remember talking about that, right? Homozygous individuals, homozygous dominant individuals don't have sickle cell, but they are really good carriers of malaria. If you're homozygous recessive, you have sickle cell anemia, and you're definitely favored against there because you develop the disease. But heterozygotes individuals, they have one allele, making some of their red blood cells sickle shaped, and so malaria doesn't quite take a hold. They don't totally have sickle cell anemia. So having this situation occur for them, right? This, oops, that was a long form of explanation there, right? Being a heterozygote individual, then you don't develop sickle cell, you don't really get malaria, and you thrive. And then that actually keeps that sickle cell allele in the population, and it maintains variety. Variety does not always necessarily mean these are great alleles to keep in the environment, but for some reason they have given you an advantage over others in the situation.